Hey everybody, it's Rosaline Starr. Today is Halloween, and what better to celebrate Halloween than with a ghost story? So today, this time, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite movies growing up as a child, the movie The 13th Ghost. Now, one thing about the movie that I find fascinating is how throughout the entire movie we see the ghosts, but we never actually get their backstories. Luckily for us, some people have actually gone through the trouble of actually creating a backstory for each and every single one of these ghosts. So, for today, I'm going to talk about each and every single ghost and their backstories and the certain things about how they died and the reason why they were chosen. Okay, so the first ghost was the Firstborn Son. Now, the Firstborn Son was the spirit of a young boy named Billy Michaels who loved to pretend to be a cowboy. And this actually had become somewhat of an obsession for him because he often was never seen without it. And at first, his parents didn't really see anything wrong with it, just a child doing what most children do. They like to play pretend. Unfortunately, this would later come to an end when one of his neighbors had realized that they had a bow and arrow and had offered to challenge Billy to a match of cowboys and Indians. Unfortunately, it turns out that Billy's little toy plastic gun was no match for the real arrow, and it pierced him in the head and killing him. Now, one thing I find fascinating about Billy is that unlike the other ghosts, he's not really that dangerous. If anything, it's more like he's kind of like a jump scare. And on some occasions, it's said that in the movie, he's even heard saying, "I want to play." Okay, so the ghost number two was the torso. Now, the torso was the spirit of a man named Jimmy Gambino, but he was also known as the Gambler. And as his nickname suggests, he had a serious gambling addiction. He lived around the time of the 90s, of the 90s, and he was unfortunately caught in a bad situation involving the mafia. Like most gamblers do, he accidentally ended up owing a very huge debt, which he was unable to pay off. Now, the cause of this was mainly due to the fact that he actually made a bet during a boxing match, and unfortunately, how ironic that he made the bet even though he actually didn't have money to bet in the first place. And since he couldn't pay the money off, the mafia decided to basically make an example out of him by cutting his body into several pieces. And they wrapped his body in some type of plastic wrap and they dumped his remains in the ocean. And as a ghost, he of course appears as a torso with a severed head nearby. And unlike just like with the Firstborn Son, he's not really that hostile. If anything, he's mostly there just to scare the crap out of the people who are unfortunate enough to cross paths with him. Okay, so the next ghost was the Bound Woman. Now, one thing I find fascinating about the Bound Woman was that she was one of the few ghosts whose death was actually the result of karma. Now, her name was Susan LeGros, and she was one of those people who was lucky enough to be born to a rich family. And of course, like any rich family, she was often spoiled by her parents. And as a result of this, she grew up with the belief that she could do whatever she wanted and there would never be any real consequence to her actions. But we all have our flaws. One of her flaws was the way she treated men. She had this little habit where she would be in a relationship with one guy and then she would suddenly go for another guy without any real warning. And as a result of this, many of her friends often told her that she really needed to be careful with that because it was only a matter of time before she messed with the wrong guy, which unfortunately was an act of advice that she actually refused to listen to. And, well, since she was one of the richest people in the town that she lived in, she of course was the popular girl. And during this time, she was dating a popular guy named Chet Walters, and he was actually very fond of her, and during the night of prom, she suddenly dumped him for a different guy. And, the next day, the boy that she left Chet for was eventually found, and he had been clubbed to death, while Susan was missing, and it actually took about 2 weeks for them to actually find her. Turned out she had been buried beneath the football field's 50-yard line, and she was found bound in rope, and it turned out that Chet had actually strangled her to death. And of course, he was arrested for his crime. and he was actually put on death row. But before they executed him, his last words were, "That bitch broke my heart, so I broke her neck." Which, unfortunately, how ironic, quite the fitting words for a girl who was so selfish that she never once really thought about how her actions could possibly affect those around her. Now, one thing I find interesting about Susan is that she's one of the ghosts that actually has the ability to speak. In one of the scenes, she was the ghost that lured Bobby into the basement, despite the ghost of his mother warning him not to go down there. Which, unfortunately, just like with Susan being given advice, this was kind of advice that Bobby didn't listen to, and as a result, Susan would give him that nice little jump scare. Now, the next one is ghost number 4, which was the Withered Lover. One thing about the Withered Lover that I truly find fascinating is that she's the only ghost that actually has a connection with the main character of the movie. Her name was Jean Criticos. I'm pretty sure I probably butchered that. And it was explained that when she was alive, she was an extremely happy and devoted wife. However, one night when she and her family were decorating a Christmas tree, they were sitting by the fire, and when they had gone to bed, they didn't know that one of the logs that was smoldering had actually rolled out of the fireplace and it had started the fire. Unfortunately, her husband, while trying to save the children, was completely unaware that Jane actually didn't get out of the house in time. And by the time he realized this, the firefighters had actually refused to let him go inside of the house in an attempt to save his wife's life. Now, she actually did survive the fire and was rushed to the hospital, but at St. Luke's Hospital, she actually ended up dying from her injuries. Hence the reason why her ghost is actually seen in hospital attire. Now, the interesting thing about the Withered Lover, or Jean, was that unlike the other ghosts who are extremely violent, even though she did, just like them, die from misery, she was actually the only ghost that never wanted to hurt anyone. And like I said with our previous ghost, she actually tried to warn her son Bobby not to go into the basement because she, unlike her family, understood the danger that was going on around them. So it seems like even in death, she's still a loving, caring person. Now, our next ghost is the Torn Prince. Now, the Torn Prince was the spirit of a young man named Royce Clayton, and it was explained that he lived in a small town, and in that town, he was known for being one of the most gifted and skilled baseball players there. And, like, of course, everyone looking for opportunity, he actually was approached by many universities who wanted him to attend there, and in his way, this was actually his dream in order to escape the small town that he lived in. Unfortunately, his life would be cut short at the age of 17 when he was eventually challenged to a race. But unknown to him, the person that had challenged him had secretly cut the brake lines to the car that he was in. So while they were racing, the car ended up losing control, and it actually flipped 3 times, crashed to the ground, and it caught on fire. And for some reason, no one actually attempted to save him, so of course he died horribly. And I guess as a way to honor him because of his love for baseball, his body was actually buried near a small hill that overlooked the baseball field that he often played at. Hence the reason why, as a ghost, his face looks torn and he often always is seen with a baseball bat. Up next is the Angry Princess. Now, just like with Jean, the Angry Princess was one of the most tragic of all the spirits. So her name was Donna Newman, and she was described as an extremely beautiful woman with the looks of a goddess. Unfortunately, she lacked the ability to see this, like she didn't see herself as beautiful, and this only got worse after a string of abusive boyfriends, which eventually caused her to suffer from a very deep depression which doctors had attempted to save her from. And by the time she reached her 20s, she was unfortunately trapped in a spiral of self-loathing. And with time, she eventually developed this desire to have a type of self-perfection, which led to her getting constant plastic surgeries, such as nose jobs, breast implants, lip injections, all kinds of surgeries that she didn't really need. But unfortunately, with time, her vanity would reach the breaking point when she began to hallucinate that she had some type of imperfection on her face, somewhere around where her eye was. And while she was in the hospital waiting for this surgery to be performed, she eventually grew impatient and had convinced herself that she could perform the procedure herself, which, unfortunately, as you would expect, had gone horribly wrong, and the procedure had left her permanently blind in one eye. So the doctors unfortunately could not undo the damage. After realizing this, she completely gave up on her desire for self-perfection, and one day, alone in her home, she stripped naked, went into the bathtub, and proceeded to slash every part of her body until she eventually bled to death. And when she had died, her own friends had actually stated that even in death, she looked beautiful. And one thing I find fascinating is how the movie itself actually kind of gives a hint as to how she died, because in one of the scenes, the daughter, Kathy, is in the bathroom washing her face in the bathtub. And unknown to her, Donna is literally sitting in the tub and the water is bloody. Hence, it literally foreshadowed her death, and even when she's standing in the mirror admiring her appearance behind Kathy. So yeah, this one I actually kind of find fascinating. It's a really tragic tale to think about. Would reach. Now, on to our next ghost. Now, our next ghost was the Pilgrimess, and the Pilgrimess was the spirit of a woman named Isabella Smith. Now, Isabella was not really a bad person when she was alive. When she was alive, she was a very kind person who just wanted to start a new life. After living most of her life as an orphan in England, she had actually moved to North America as a colonist in order to find a new life. And unfortunately, she chose one of the worst places to live in because she lived in like a tight-knit community. And to make matters worse, sometime after she had arrived there, strange illnesses began to plague the farm animals that lived there, and no one understood what was going on. So, of course, the villagers decided to use her as a scapegoat, blaming her for everything and even accusing her of being a witch. And despite the fact that she denied this, they still went after her, eventually trapping her in a barn which they lit on fire. And surprisingly, she was actually able to escape the barn completely unharmed. Not a single scratch or not even a single burn on her. And when the villagers saw this, this actually ended up unfortunately sealing her fate, because to this little tight-knit community, they were now 100% convinced that she was in fact a witch and that they weren't wrong in accusing her. So as a result of this, they decided that she would be condemned to the death by pillory. And so she was basically forced to have a slow, agonizingly painful death. During this time, children would throw rocks at her, women would curse at her, and men would spit at her. And despite all the pain she was in, for Isabella, the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation that she was forced to endure after spending a majority of her life being ostracized, being accused of something she more than likely didn't do. This was nothing compared to what they made her go through in her final moments. And she would tragically end up dying due to starvation. And as a ghost, she's actually one of the more violent ones, obviously wanting to inflict as much pain on others like the pain that she. Now, our next ghosts are personal favorites of mine, the Great Child and the Dire Mother. One thing I find interesting about these ghosts is that they're the only ones that actually come together as a pair. Now, the Dire Mother was a young woman named Margaret Shelbourne, and it was explained that she was unable to stand up for herself throughout her life, mainly due to the fact that she was literally only 3 feet tall. And when she was younger, she was often teased for her extremely small size, And at some point, her mother would even go as far as to treat her like she was a doll. And to be honest, she was okay with this because she was willing to accept any type of thing in life if it meant she could find some type of acceptance. Eventually, she was discovered by a carnival man named Jimbo, who eventually ended up allowing her to be a part of his circus, and he put her on display. Now, during her life at the circus, life wasn't very easy for her due to the fact that she kind of didn't like being constantly gawked at by other people, and how even among other freaks, she was still basically picked on. And the birth of her son came when one day, while she was cleaning one of the pens, she was raped by the tall man, which resulted in the birth of her son, Harold. Now, despite the traumatic cause of the birth of her son, she actually loved him very deeply. Margaret loved her son so much that she often never allowed him to leave her side. And it was because of this, she actually smothered him ever since he was a young boy and all the way up to his adult life, which, as a result, he basically acts like a small child, never even growing out of diapers. Due to his large size, he was actually fiercely protective of his mother and didn't like the idea of other people hurting her. As a result, the two were an inseparable pair. But one day, some of the workers at the circus decided to pull a cruel prank on them, and they kidnapped Margaret and placed her in a sack. And during this time, Harold went insane trying desperately to find her. Eventually, he did find his mother, only to find that she had tragically suffocated to death inside the sack. And out of rage, he ended up taking an axe and he killed each and every single one of the pranksters and put their corpses on display for people to see. As punishment, he was killed by the remaining workers in the circus. Now, one thing I find fascinating about these two is that, unlike the other ghosts so far, these two are the only ones that actually have a second idea of how they died. The other way that they had potentially died was that one day Harold had choked on his vomit, and he ended up falling on top of his mother and ended up crushing her to death. Hence the reason why, as a ghost, his bib is covered in what seems to be vomit, but more than likely it's probably food. Okay, so the next ghost is the Hammer. One thing I find interesting about the Hammer is, like, he is one of the most violent of all the spirits. But after learning about his backstory, it's understandable why he was as violent as he was. When he was still alive, he was a man named George Markley, and he was a blacksmith who lived in a town. And he was actually a very good man. He was a hard worker, he was a good father, and a good husband. But one day, a higher-up named Nathan had accused him of stealing from the place where they worked, and had told him that he needs to leave the town. Like, he wanted to run him out. But because George was 100% sure that he knew that he was innocent, so he refused to leave, which later turned out to be something that a part of me thinks that he probably regretted. While his wife and two children were on their way home from the market, Nathan and his gang decided to attack them and ended up brutally murdering George's family. Out of rage, George tracked down Nathan and his little helpers and brutally beat them to death with his hammer. Unfortunately, despite the fact that technically speaking his actions were the act of justice, the townspeople felt like what he did was wrong and therefore they went after him. Once they found him, they dragged him back to his home and they tied him to a tree where they decided to enact their own form of justice. Afterwards, they proceeded to impale him with large nails using his hammer. And once they were done hammering the nails in him, they cut off one of his arms and replaced it with his hammer. And after some time, he would eventually end up dying from his injuries. So, yeah, definitely an understandable reason why he is so angry and vengeful towards practically everyone who is unfortunate enough to cross his path. He tried to get justice, but the world punished him for trying to achieve it. Now, our next ghost is kind of a bit of a doozy, the Jackal. The Jackal is probably one of the most insane of all the ghosts, and he was once a human man named Ryan Kun, and it was explained that he was born around 1987, and he was the son of a prostitute. Now, it was explained that apparently he was actually abused by his mother, and as a result, this actually caused him to develop somewhat of a dislike towards women. And as he grew older, it was explained that he was known for attacking and in some sources say that he even raped them. But eventually he began to realize that he had a problem. So he actually voluntarily committed himself to a mental hospital in the vain hope that they could cure him of his illness. Unfortunately, the people in the asylum didn't really treat him that well. They actually abused him on several occasions, and they even went as far as keeping him locked up in a padded room, condemning him to solitary confinement, which resulted with him constantly scratching on the walls until his fingernails eventually came off. As a result, they had to place him in a straitjacket, and whenever he either acted out or tried to free himself, they would tighten it. And this in turn actually resulted with his limbs contorting. And this actually worked for a while until he eventually actually bit his way out of the straitjacket. Hence the reason why they eventually would go on to place an iron cage around his head to prevent him from doing that again. But with time, his violence actually got worse. So as a result of this, they actually locked him in the basement of the asylum, which in time only caused his insanity to increase, and he eventually developed an intense hatred towards humanity in general. And his death would eventually be the result of the asylum catching fire, and everyone else had escaped but him. In one version, it's explained that he actually willingly stayed in the fire and chose to accept his fate, but personally, I actually believe that he more than likely tried to escape but couldn't, because in the movie it's explained that he's actually deathly afraid of fire to the point where it's actually used in order to scare him away, which would imply that he more than likely didn't willingly stay in the fire to die, because, well, it's a pretty awful way to die. So his insanity is kind of understandable, more than likely the result of a mental illness he probably didn't even know he had, and the doctors just didn't know how to deal with it. Now, our next ghost, and close to being our final one, number 12, is the one that I actually was afraid of as a child, the Juggernaut. Now, the Juggernaut was a man named Horace Breaker, and it was explained that when Horace was born, he was born like somewhat deformed, and he was born with like an extremely abnormally large body. And when he was still very young, he was actually abandoned by his mother, leaving him in the care of his father, who basically seemed to just not really care about him, simply putting him to work in the junkyard where he was in charge of crushing cars. Throughout his childhood, he was outcast by others who basically mocked him for his appearance. When when his father had passed away, this is when he finally lost his sanity, because he basically lived a large portion of his life being basically told what to do by his father. And his first victims were two hitchhikers that he had lured into his junkyard, and he actually tore them apart with his bare hands, because by the time he was an adult, he was literally about 7 feet tall. And after killing the girls, he fed their bodies to his dogs, and this would eventually become his calling card. He would murder young hitchhikers, and he would feed them to his pets. And he continued this for quite a long while, until eventually he would eventually be outsmarted when he picked up a hitchhiker who later turned out to be an undercover cop. Once help had arrived, he actually put up a pretty good fight, killing quite a few of the officers. But after 15 rounds of ammunition, he finally went down, with one more shot between the eyes just to ensure that he was in fact dead. One thing that I find fascinating about the Juggernaut was that in the very beginning of the movie, he's actually like the first ghost to actually appear. And unlike the other ghosts, he never really did have a reason to be violent. Maybe there was a possibility that he was suffering from some type of mental illness, but it's never fully explained. But that's number 12 for you. And now for what we all been waiting for, the 13th ghost. Now, one thing I find fascinating about the 13th ghost, which is nicknamed the Broken Heart, is that unlike the other ghosts, the 13th ghost actually didn't get to exist. The 13th ghost was actually different from the other ghosts because this one was supposed to be a person who would voluntarily sacrifice their life for the sake of another after dealing with a painful experience. Now, had things had gone to plan, the person that had been chosen to be the 13 Goats was supposed to be Arthur Criticus, the husband of Jean, aka the Withered Lover. But luckily, he was able to outsmart his uncle and avoid becoming the 13th ghost, and yet still being able to save his remaining family. And so, this is the tale of the 13 Goats, and I hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned because I actually might do a little bit more of these in the near future.